Guys, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat functionality. Of course, few of you might have already seen some of the sessions that we have done in the last 2 weeks. And would be great, yeah, if you have any questions, if you have any comments on anything, you would like Cliff to explain anything like in more detail, feel free to use the chat box. Cliff, I can help moderate a session a bit as well, just to point out anything.
Yeah, Karan, I was just telling Suvida that how I intend to kind of conduct this is that I'll share my screen and then I'll go into presentation mode. And then I will stop at every section. So I've organized the slides to be in sections. So once I reach the end of one section, I will exit the presentation and then look through like the chat boxes to see if there's any questions that I can answer. If not, then I will just proceed on.
Cool, sounds great.
Mm.
Maybe we can give 1 more minute for people to join and then we can.
Yeah, sure. No worries. I know it's like, sorry, am I freezing up or anything? Is it okay? I just want to make sure that my internet is okay, because just now when I was speaking with Suvida, like the internet was a bit laggy.
No, it's fine at my end. All good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we can wait until like say 8:05 your time. Sorry, I'm trying to do like some math because I'm actually now in Thailand. 8:05, just because like I know people are finishing up with dinner. So yeah, happy to wait a little bit more. Yeah, let's target to start at 8:05 then.
Sounds good. Guys, in the meantime, if you don't mind mentioning in the chat if you have attended any of the previous sessions, that would just give us more context on how much background you have. And of course, maybe I can also introduce a bit about dYdX if required. So it would be great if you can like mention in the chat if you were there in the last 2 sessions. Thanks for that. And if you guys don't mind switching on your videos, that would be great as well. It would just make it more interactive.
Yeah, I don't want to just be stalking Karan. I see him a lot already. I'm kidding. So how many sessions have you had so far, Karan?
We had 2 more, 2 before this. So one we did on intro to DeFi. Second one was about some of the applications of DeFi. So we talked about decentralized exchanges, lending and borrowing, stable coins. Yeah, this is going to be one of the most interesting one, I would say, because this is a relatively new topic for most of the people, I would think here.
I hope so.
Next one, we have Vivan from the India community team. He would be taking the next session on community and marketing in Web3. So that's next week. And then we are doing an in-person event at T-Hub campus in Hyderabad next Wednesday. So if you guys, of course, all of you are invited to join, and I'm sure Suvida can share more details on that.
Sounds good. So did you share any of your like degen trading strategies last week? I mean, on the previous session?
None of this is trading advice. None of this is financial advice. Please, guys, do your own research.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, Cliff, I think we should be ready to start any minute now. So up to you if you want to share your screen and go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, let me share my screen. Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
Cool. Let me start sharing from the top. Cool. So, sorry, is it in full screen right now or no?
Yeah, full screen.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for having me again, Karan and T-Hub family. My name is Clifton. I work on governance and a little bit of Southeast Asia growth over at the dYdX Foundation. So work closely with Karan on all things dYdX related, and kind of happy to kind of talk to you guys a little bit more about DAOs and governance in DeFi protocols today. So again, big disclaimer, as per all sessions, none of this is financial advice. Please do your own research, and hopefully you guys can have some good takeaways from this educational session. And yeah, just want to stress again that, you know, none of this is going to be financial advice, and any actions that you take are actions of your own. And yeah. So let's start off by asking ourselves, like, what are DAOs? So DAOs are this like super hot jargon that a lot of crypto people throw around. So what exactly is a DAO? A DAO stands for a Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and that essentially means that it is a collectively owned blockchain organization working towards a shared mission. So nothing too fancy. You can just imagine it as like an everyday company or an everyday organization or a community that is on the blockchain, and everyone in that community or organization is actually working towards a shared mission. So a more deeper definition is that it actually allows individuals to work with like-minded folks around the globe without trusting a specific set of individuals or one leader per se, right? So essentially, if you think about how things are being run today in traditional organizations, we have CEOs, we have board of directors, we have all these leaders in these different organizations. So in DAOs, ideally, we don't have any one of these individuals that can spend funds on a whim or manipulate the books and do all these shenanigans, because everything will be rules based and it's going to be immutable in the blockchain once the DAO is kind of created. So in a way, I think it's important to note that a lot of DAOs actually operate on the notion that there is trustlessness, right? Because everyone knows that when you want to start a new initiative, when you start a new company and a new organization, you actually more often than not have to pour in funds, and you actually need to trust the people that you're working with, right? But for DAOs, I think it's very difficult to actually trust people who we have only interacted with over the internet, right? And that's why DAOs are actually a very good tool to collaborate with people, just because everything is going to be rules-based, code-based, which is going to be ideally 100% transparent, and everyone can verify that all actions are actually voted on by the community and all based on the code that was actually constituted. So I think the fact that it is trustless, that no one can actually overstep their boundaries, actually opens up a lot of new opportunities for collaboration and coordination. Right. So what was the first DAO that was ever created? So the first DAO that was ever created was literally called the DAO, right? So this is the OG DAO. And this was formed by folks from the Ethereum Foundation. And the intent of this DAO was to actually operate like a VC fund for the entire crypto space. So how did it work, right? So they essentially first had a creation period where anyone could deposit ETH into the DAO's unique address, right? And in exchange, they would actually get DAO tokens on a 1 to 100 scale. So if you deposited 1 ETH, then you will get 100 DAO tokens. And throughout the entire fundraising process, 12.7 million Ether was raised. So this all happened in 2016, early 2016. And what this DAO also enable is for anyone to essentially pitch their idea to the community. So imagine like a Shark Tank format where entrepreneurs or teams would actually put out their ideas to the DAO and potentially receive funding from the DAO members, right? So anyone with DAO tokens could essentially vote on plans and invest funds into these projects. And if these projects that are invested in return the profit, then the DAO token holders could potentially also enjoy these profits as well, right? So this actually raised a lot of regulatory eyebrows, just because it was seen as potentially a security, because people could actually buy these tokens and expect a profit from the efforts of others that actually got funding from the DAO, right? So this DAO unfortunately got hacked, right? So on June 17, 2016, a hacker actually found a loophole in the smart contract code, and he drained roughly 3.6 million ETH in the first few hours of the attack, right? So how did this exploit work, right? So essentially what he did was he kept requesting the DAO to disburse funds, to disburse ETH into his own wallet before the smart contract could essentially update its balance, right? So just to put some numbers into sense, say for example, the DAO had 100 ETH and I, as the attacker, I ask it for 5 ETH. So technically what the DAO should have done is that it should have updated its balance first to 95 ETH before transferring that 5 ETH over to my account, right? But I think the hackers didn't really take this into account, and they actually dispersed the funds. So essentially, the DAO would actually give me 5 ETH first before it updated the balance to 95 ETH. And the hacker actually exploited this and did a lot of calls, recursive calls, before the balance was actually updated. So that was how they essentially drained 3.6 million worth of ETH. Right. So how did the DAO hack get remedied? So in a way, the Ethereum community and, people behind the DAO, quickly to control the situation, and they actually presented many different proposals to deal with this exploit, right? So, and it's a good thing that it was coded in such a way that, you couldn't actually extract the ETH to your own custodial wallet until 28 days. So in a way, that holding period kind of ensured that the DAO hacker couldn't complete his getaway. And this event was such a big thing that, the community actually voted to hard fork to restore the stolen funds, where DAO token holders were actually given an exchange rate of 1 ETH to 100 DAO tokens. So if you held DAO tokens, you could actually exchange it back for your ETH, and everything would be, back to square one. Right, but I think like this violates the whole essence of being decentralized and being trustless, right? So a lot of people actually did not agree with this decision to hard fork, and that is why like the Ethereum network essentially split into the Ethereum that we know today. And for those that didn't agree, there is this new chain called, it's not new, but like back in 2016. Ethereum Classic was created. So this was essentially the original version, and the ETH that we all know, the Ethereum that we all know today, was actually the hard forked version, right? So ETH Classic, essentially the hack did happen, and the funds were never restored. And for the Ethereum the main chain that we are all familiar with today, essentially had everything on the hack reversed. Right, so that's a little bit about the history of the original DAO. And then a few of the next slides that I'll go through next are examples of DAOs that we have today. And then after that, I'll stop to see whether there are any questions that I can answer, right? So I think like this DAO was a big event, right? Like a lot of people actually questioned like whether DAOs could even exist, like whether it was a tenable model for organizations. And it's there were a lot of big lessons from this DAO hack that happened, right? So one would be security, right? If you think about it, the DAO hack was actually a problem with how the contracts were being coded. It wasn't a problem of the Ethereum blockchain, right? So had the code been written correctly, the DAO hack could have been avoided. And this is something that a lot of DAO developers, a lot of protocols are actually keeping in mind. Like they need to make sure that their code goes through rigorous testings and audits just to make sure that all loopholes are essentially covered, and nothing should be taken for granted, because hackers are, very determined, if they are, to exploit any possible loophole. And there is also a need to, navigate regulations deliberately, right? Like as I was explaining earlier, for DAO token holders, they could essentially get a profit if the DAO, if the projects that the DAO actually invested in returned one, right, and decided to give back value. So what that means is that if you held the DAO token and there was value back accruing to you, then based on the Howey test, essentially you are holding a security, right? And it should not be listed unless it is cleared by the securities or regulatory bodies tests. So yeah, I think like now a lot of protocols and a lot of DeFi communities are actually very deliberate when it comes to navigating regulations, just because like the original DAO had to go through this whole regulatory issue with the SEC, because it was clear that holding DAO tokens were a form of security. Right, so examples of DAOs that we have today, right? So I think, again, the DAO hack was a big one, but it didn't really stop innovation on the DAO front. So I'm going to go through a few of the more prominent DAOs that we have today. So MakerDAO is one of the most famous ones, one of the most earlier ones as well. So it's the decentralized global reserve bank of the Ethereum blockchain, and it's the minter of the DAI stablecoin, right? So they leverage smart contracts to automate the over-collateralization and lending of its stablecoin called DAI. Through collateralized debt positions, right? So I don't know if any of you have actually tried the Maker protocol before, but if you want, you can actually mint DAI by depositing collaterals into what they call collateralized debt positions, right? So it's over collateralized, which means to say that you have to put in more than what you can mint, and rightfully so, right? So this is a protection against bad actors, right? And it makes sure that the whole DAO is actually sustainable. So if you put in, say, 120 ETH you can only get out 100 ETH worth of DAI. Right. Overall on the NFT side, I think Nouns DAO is quite a prominent DAO that would be worth mentioning. So essentially, people would have to purchase or mint a Noun NFT in order to be a part of the Nouns DAO. And by being a part of the Nouns DAO, they can essentially request for their projects to be funded under the Nouns treasury. So you would need to hold at least two Nouns NFTs to submit proposals, and all other Noun holders will have to vote on whether your project should be funded or not. So in a way, it's trustless because if the votes are actually being passed, then the funds will automatically get dispersed, unless it's something that is very controversial, that actually affects the treasury in great detail, or is an attack. Then it will be vetoed by the founders. Right, so MakerDAO, Nouns DAO are prominent DAOs that we have in DeFi and the NFT space. And we look at something that is a little bit more relatable, right? So Constitution DAO is actually an interesting one. So essentially a group of individuals actually decided that they wanted to buy the US Constitution just because they believe that this is a public good and it shouldn't be in the hands of a specific organization or any one individual. So these individuals actually got together, created a DAO called Constitution DAO, and started raising funds, right? So in 7 days, they actually collectively raised 42 million. And in this process, they actually onboarded a lot of people into Web3 and educated millions about what it's like being in Web3. So it broke records for being the largest crowdfund for a physical object, which is the US Constitution. And most of the money that were crowdfunded were actually returned to people who actually participated, because Citadel, the renowned TradFi player, actually came in and won the auction to buy the Constitution, unfortunately. So the son, I believe it's the son of the founder of Citadel, actually now owns the Constitution, the original copy. But I mean, this whole experiment has been a win for Web3, just because, again, it showed that people could rally around a cause and do collective actions together. So they raised funds, and in a sense that when it actually failed, everyone actually got back their money. So no one actually lost anything outside of having to pay some gas fees or whatnot. And then we also have City DAO, which actually aims to buy over plots of land through a DAO, right? So their mission is actually to build an on-chain community-governed crypto city. So to do that, first they would have to actually buy land, right? So people would actually register to be a part of City DAO. They would put in money, and then they would actually vote to see which plots of land they would want to buy. And then they have actually bought 40 acres of land near Yellowstone Park, which is cool because we've never heard of people on the internet buying over pieces of land together. It's usually again, rich individuals can do that, or organizations that can do that, but never a collective of individuals over the internet that have bonded over a shared cause. Cool. So I'll stop here before I go into governance to see if you guys have any questions. So let me navigate back to the Google Meet chat really quickly. Seems like there are no questions. So, maybe I'll give everyone 2 minutes. If you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand and speak. If not, I can proceed. Karan, do you think the pace is good? Are the examples good?
Yeah, the pace is good. Guys, if you have, of course, I think your feedback would be more important than mine. So if you think we should reduce the pace, let us know. And if you have any specific questions or any comments or any suggestions on any product that you're working on, or if you want to get more involved with DAOs and you have questions around how to get involved, feel free to ask in the chat. I think there is one question there, Clifton.
Yep. So Uday asked, for City DAO, on whose name is the property registered with under the central authority, like the registration department, and as DAOs doesn't have any legal entity. So I think this is something, okay, for City DAO in particular, I haven't done much research into what name this plot of land actually is registered under. But a lot of DAOs today, including the sub-DAOs of dYdX, we essentially have what we call legal wrappers, and we actually establish like an entity structure to wrap the DAO around, so that we can go out as a DAO to actually sign contracts, to actually assign ownership of physical items under the organization's ownership, right? So it's very similar to like an LLC or whatsoever. So a lot of DAOs actually use structures like Cayman Foundations or British Virgin Islands Foundations or Guernsey Purpose Trust, for example, to actually assign, to wrap a legal structure, a legal entity around the DAO, so that they can go out to sign all of these contracts and get real world contracting done for the DAO. But in particular for City DAO, I would need to do a little bit more reading to understand. Yeah, Sanjay, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Lee, Clifton. So I think this is a very interesting. City DAO seems to be quite exciting. I guess this is in line with the Balaji's proponent about network state, and I have been following his for quite some time now. So if you look at a regulatory hurdle could be a big challenge here in establishing the legitimacy of these places, which will fall within the sovereignty of any nation, while this structure would like to operate as an autonomous state. Okay, so which in my view possibly could be a little challenge. So obviously things are evolving. So I guess probably that will also be overcome one day. But if you look at a similar structure in a physical form existing today, then in India, similar kind of a structure is already existing today in physical form by the name Auroville. So you should check out that. That came into existence way back in 1968. Okay. So it's a small place near which is called Pondicherry. Within Pondicherry, it's a area which is around in some 10-12 square kilometer radius has been given to that place, wherein people from almost like 150 countries, around 3,000 residents are staying there, and it's a self-sustained city, having its own rules, regulations, and everything within the sovereignty of India, actually. Unbelievably independent state. They have their own power generation, own economy. They do a lot of export as well. So pretty interesting, actually. So that's why I thought of just putting that perspective to you. Probably you may like to check out Auroville. It's very impressive, very, very impressive.
Auroville, got it.
Auroville, yeah.
Yeah, got it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Karan,
thank you so much.
Thanks for that shout out, Sanjay. I think like the laws differ for every jurisdiction. So Pavan actually had a question around like Delaware has a legal sanctity. Can you shed some light on that? Is this similar to LLP or LLC? So unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not actually in the best position to comment about like any forms of legal structure. But what I can share is that, the operations sub DAO for the dYdX DAO has actually recently posted a DAO playbook, and it essentially goes through the three most suitable entity structures that sub DAOs can kind of consider. So Karan, if you don't mind, could you share a link here to the DAO playbook? But essentially, like what this playbook does, it is essentially goes through a checklist, right? So we need to understand exactly what the DAO is trying to achieve, what its purpose is, whether it's revenue generating or whether it's charity or whether it's non-profit. And then depending on the questions and answers that the members of the DAO have for things in the checklist, then it would actually recommend a specific entity. But it only covers right now a Guernsey Purpose Trust, a Cayman's Foundation, as well as a United States Nonprofit Association, which is a UNA. So yeah, hopefully that is helpful. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not a trained lawyer, so I'm not in the best position to comment on anything legal related.
Thanks for that, Cliff.
Cool.
Just
hopefully that. Yeah,
Just
go
to
ahead.
give an interesting personal experience, I participated in the Constitution DAO. So those of you who don't have context there, it was, as Cliff mentioned, it was people coming together, buying a copy of the Constitution. I think it was the 11th copy. One of the challenges, interesting challenges that we saw during that time, and I was following it very closely. I had invested a bit into participating in this, and I was following the entire auction that was happening at Sotheby's. It was kind of an event at my place. Me and my wife were like sitting together with some popcorn in our hand, looking at the auction. This is the whether it's the DAO that purchases the Constitution or other people who are auctioning. So one of the challenge there was that other people who were participating in the auction had a very clear visibility of the total funds that were raised. It was publicly available. It's available on the blockchain. They knew that the DAO has maximum 42 million funds. So the investor clearly had a mindset that if they wanted to outbid the DAO, they can simply put any amount bigger than that because the DAO didn't have that many funds. So that
Yeah.
was a challenge. I believe they participated in another auction. I wasn't part of it, but there they were trying to conceal this fact around how much funds have been raised through some zero knowledge proof. So this was an interesting thing that, yeah, this is an evolving space. There are, of course, mistakes to be made and lessons to be learned.
Yeah, for sure. But I think like Constitution DAO has been a successful experiment, even though like the end goal of curing the Constitution wasn't achieved. I think like, showing that people could actually rally around and really throw funds into a shared belief and, have everything so transparently being executed is just proof that DAOs can actually work. It's just, to your point, a lot of pros and cons because in an auction setting, your competitive investor would actually, or your competitive bidder will actually know how much you can bid and then outbid you that way. So yeah. Okay, cool. Let me jump back into the presentation really quickly. Thanks for everyone's questions. So how do DAOs actually make decisions, right? And how do DeFi protocols today, a lot of NFT communities, how do all these crypto communities actually make decisions? And that boils down to governance, right? So governance essentially means how decision-making works, how stakeholders and protocol participations actually coordinate to make decisions to change the rules of a protocol, right? And this can, vary from small changes like, requesting a couple of $1,000s from the treasury to big items like, changing the entire consensus mechanisms or allocating block rewards. So decision-making essentially equals to governance when it comes to DAOs, right? And I think when it comes to, voting, especially when it comes to governance, it's something that, experimentation isn't very advanced in yet, right? Like we have a very simple one token, one vote model in most DAOs today, in most crypto communities today, which is sad, but it's the most direct form of direct democracy. And through decentralization, people will actually think that this simplicity actually is the best way to govern protocols moving forward, because the amount of capital that you put in should be the amount of say you have. But of course, like a lot of people wouldn't agree with that because not everyone has the big bags to kind of get their number of votes in. So I think for traditional corporations, this fits the use case, but crypto is special, right? We value decentralization, we value democracy, and we value community, especially on the community front. A lot of the most active community members actually are not the biggest token holders, just because, again, not everyone has the capital to procure all these tokens, right? So we need to think about ways to elevate a lot of these community leaders to make decisions just because like they are the lifeblood of a lot of protocols. They are the ones who have been the most active on Discords, on the community forums, and they are the ones answering a lot of questions outside of the core team. So essentially, a lot of the times they are actually in the best possible positions to make decisions for the bigger collective. All right, so when it comes to governance, I think a lot of DAOs follow a typical process. It first starts on discussions on governance forums, right? So we have quite a few protocols using Discourse, Reddit, as well as Commonwealth as common forum platforms, right? So this is where like people would say, okay, I have this new proposal. These are all the things I'm looking to change. Can I get some feedback, right? So usually the proposal goes out in text form, right? And then everyone would deliberate, discuss about the pros and cons, discuss, how the proposal can be refined. And then once the community kind of gets to like a good place, then more often than not, people would initiate an off-chain vote. So this is the stage where, people essentially use their tokens to vote, right? And it's off-chain because a lot of the times, like, we don't want immediately to pay gas to cast our votes. Maybe that is a barrier to entry for a lot of people to vote. So there are tools like Snapshot that actually enable a sentiment signaling or an off-chain through an off-chain vote. So essentially, you don't have to pay gas because it's off-chain again. And if there is strong consensus from the community, then the proposer might request to move this to an on-chain vote. So for example, literally putting up a proposal that is settled on-chain, and then all votes are also cast on-chain. So that's where, like, it can essentially ratify the vote, and and once the vote actually passes, anyone from the community can essentially call the smart contract to initiate the changes if it's voted through, right? So again, it starts off with basic discussions, right? And then once there is a good sense of what the proposal is, it goes to an off-chain vote, and a tool like Snapshot kind of supports that. And then if it requires some form of deployments or any changes to smart contracts, then more often than not, it has to be moved on-chain where people actually have to pay gas support, right? So unfortunately, for every step of the way, you can think of it as like a funnel, because people do drop out. People actually don't find the need to vote. Like, voter apathy is actually quite real. So it's unfortunate that like there's this drop-off, but this is the state of a lot of the process that DeFi governance has today. It's the same for dYdX, right? So we have a forum on Discourse, and then we have many discussions here. And then once the discussions, if they are meant to be proposals, then proposer will actually create, sorry, it's a little small, but try to see, and I am happy to kind of share the links post this call to all these resources. So once the proposal has gotten quite a bit of traction on the community forums, then more often than not, the proposer would have to create an off-chain vote using Snapshot. So voting here, again, doesn't require gas. And if it requires any forms of smart contract changes, then people would have to create like an on-chain vote. And this is where like gas fees would need to be paid for votes to happen. Right, so I think when it comes to governance, it's very important to always question like first principles, right? Why do we actually need to vote? Who are the stakeholders? Who should actually vote? Should all token holders vote? Do all token holders actually have the best context possible to make the informed decision for the DAO, the protocol, right? A lot of token holders are unfortunately just airdrop farmers or maybe yield farmers. They don't actually know the ins and outs of the protocol. They don't know what's best for the protocol. So should they be in decision-making powers? Should they even be allowed to vote, right? So this is an important question that all protocols and all DAOs should ask themselves, right? And the fact that, a lot of DAOs are actually built on top of blockchains, or most DAOs, in fact, is because like, there's this sense of trustlessness, there's this sense of immutability, right? So you shouldn't be changing a lot of things just because it should be baked in the code. So thinking about what areas can governance change and what should be immutable is something that I think all DAOs and all protocols need to think about. What decisions can be made off-chain versus what needs to go on-chain, right? Because again, like, on-chain requires you to pay gas, and that's where like we can see significant drop-off. So what if the off-chain vote is actually, voting results is actually different from the on-chain voting results, right? Should a new vote be cast? Which vote is actually final, right? So a lot of protocols, again, have to think about, what decisions should be made off-chain versus on-chain. And then it comes to efficiency versus equitable decision-making, right? Do we want to make sure that we get governance to be fast, right? Because there are some changes that need to go within, say, an hour or a day, just because it might affect the whole protocol's health and going concerns, right? But at the same time, like, are we actually giving token holders enough time to vote? And then on equitable decision-making, like, what if a whale actually comes in with, say, like 3 million tokens or 5 million tokens and sway the entirety of the vote just because they don't want it to happen, right? What about the hundreds of community members that actually voted against that? So is that fair? Is that equitable? So this is a question that a lot of governance teams are also thinking through when they're designing their entire governance process. Okay, so before I go into governance models, maybe I will pause again and look through some questions, because I think like covered quite a bit, and I actually heard the oh, it was Karan actually sharing links. Thanks, Karan. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hands to ask. I see that Sanjay has his hand raised and Bajan has his hand raised as well. So Bajan, maybe you can go first. Bajan, are you there? Saw you raise your hand. Karan, do we have any hands raised? Let me have a quick look.
I don't see any. There's a question by Deepak in the chat.
Okay, got it. So Deepak's asking, what would be the ideal way of closing a proposal? Default time window or letting proposer choose his own closing time period? So for a lot of protocols, actually, all of these are predefined, right? So we ideally don't want, governance to be ad hoc, right? We want to make sure that as much as possible, things are standardized. So most protocols actually have like fixed time periods for each stage of the governance process. So for example, let me just go back to that relevant slide really quickly, right? So for discussions on governance forums, that usually is like a week or so. Like, community guidelines actually do state that, like, if you want to push through a proposal, it needs to be on the forums for at least a week so that the community can kind of debate about it, present their ideas, present their feedback, and then there can be some forms of refinement. And then once that is done, it goes to an off-chain vote. So usually for off-chain votes for Snapshot, the window period is 4 days, right? So upon creation, it goes through 1 day delay, and then after a 1 day delay, then people will actually get to vote on the snapshot for 4 days. Pretty standard across a lot of other protocols. And then if an on-chain vote is created, similarly, like there is like a time delay, and then there is a fixed voting period, whether it's like 4 days, whether it's a week or so. Depending on the type of change. And then after that, there's usually like a queue period and then an execution period. So that's something that we have over at dYdX as well. Let me try to find that really quickly for you guys. So I think a lot of these should be well documented, and this is something that we've done as well. So let me just find this right. So, oh, sorry, I'm actually sharing just my window. Let me change the sharing really quickly. Let me just share my entire screen so it's easier. Sorry, there's going to be like a mirror. Yep. So so a lot of protocols actually well document how the voting or the entire proposal process goes, right? So you can kind of see that like there are voting delays, and then there are voting durations, and then how long does it take for the vote to be executed. And then if you look above, like, there are also certain thresholds. So, okay, this is the end-to-end like process. So again, forum discussion, you create a DRC, which is the post on the forums, and then you gather feedback, and then you go through snapshot, and then if necessary, then you go on to create an on-chain vote, and then the on-chain voting happens, right? So what we have specifically for dYdX are also thresholds. So if you want to create an on-chain vote, you need to hold a certain supply of tokens, and there is a reason for that, right? And that's because like we don't want our entire governance pipeline to be consisting of garbage proposals. We want to make sure that we guard against these attacks per se. So we want to make sure that if it's a proposal, people actually need to have a reasonable supply to propose stuff. Of course, there are cons as well, just because like not everyone's going to have that level of capital. But I think like a lot of times, whenever there are governance attacks, it's because like there are way too many proposals and some just get passed without the community actually looking at it. So to guard against that, I think these thresholds are actually important. Right. So hopefully that kind of answers your question, Deepak. Let me stop sharing again and then reshare. 1 second. Cool. Karthik had a question. So is there a necessary to have on-chain voting? Thinking in terms of the gas being a limiting factor. So I was curious to whether a DAO can be run with only off-chain voting. So that's interesting. I think there needs to be a well-defined split, because sometimes, when it comes to smart contracts, you require on-chain actions to be able to change it and for anyone to be able to deploy that change, right? And for that to happen, you would need to have it go on-chain. If it's fully off-chain, then you're actually relying on a central person to actually implement the necessary changes. And for certain changes, I think it's important for anyone in the community to kind of vet through and to make sure that, okay, the votes are actually legitimate. The front end isn't like, masquerading some numbers. The numbers of vote cast is actually correctly reflected on-chain. So anyone can essentially verify that, and anyone can essentially execute the contract once it's called. So once it's executed, it's final, and no one can essentially come in and stop it, unless it's something that goes against like the proposal, unless it has severe consequences like draining the treasury or whatsoever. So yes, I think there needs to be some proposals that go on chain for that verifiable reason, for that verifiable component reason. Yep, all good. Okay, cool. I don't think there are any more questions, so let me move on really quickly. So I stopped here. Right, so there are many different protocols that have enacted different governance models. So I think like if you see on the left, there are two areas. Like there is centralized decision making and there's one token, one vote. I think centralized decision making happens a lot for DAOs, which are very, very new, where team members are not mature enough, or they are not confident enough to execute certain discussions, push through certain discussions and execute certain changes. So even though it's not ideal, even though it's not entirely Web3, some changes need to be made, some progress needs to be made, right? So more often than not, it's actually the core teams, the core foundations that are actually pushing through a lot of discussions and voting on a lot of these proposals. So in a way, it seems centralized, and then hopefully the protocol kind of iterates and the community kind of matures so that more and more people can participate. So it's a little bit more decentralized. But I think for a lot of younger protocols, for a lot of younger communities, centralized decision-making is something that is quite common. So for the one token, one vote, I think I elaborated on this a little earlier. It's literally, if you hold one token, you can have one vote. But, in this model, we have many flaws because one, not every token holder is actually someone who is very involved in the protocol. There are airdrop farmers, there are yield farmers that, just hold a token for speculative reasons, right? So if, we want to give everyone an equal vote, then maybe you will only get a certain percentage voting, right? Across the board, across all DeFi protocols, we've actually seen only approximately 4% or 5% of token holders actually vote, which is not ideal at all. And this also opens a new question, a new challenge, right? In the sense that people who actually are super active and they actually don't have enough capital, if they actually want to push something forward, but a big investor actually thinks that, it's actually not suitable, it actually will harm my bags or whatsoever, then they might vote against that. So imagine just one investor outvoting, say, 500 community members. That's not equitable, even though they have more tokens, so they should get more votes, right? So there are a lot of flaws with this model, even though it's simple. And I think protocols and communities have done well in experimenting, but it needs to be a little bit more innovative. So these are some of the new models that we've seen, a little bit more innovative models that we've seen so far. And I'm going to go through each of them in a bit more detail. So let's start with delegates, right? So delegation is something that I think a lot of protocols have actually implemented. So delegation essentially means that you as a token holder can entrust your token's voting and proposing power to another address. You as a token holder still holds custody of the tokens, and you can decide when you want to sell the tokens. But the tokens, voting powers and proposing powers is something that you are entrusting to another address, right? So if Karan has dYdX tokens and he wants to delegate to me, he still holds his dYdX tokens, but his tokens, voting and proposing powers are now in my control if he's delegated to me. So delegation, in most cases, it's permissionless, meaning to say you can delegate to any one address, all right? And you can undelegate at the same time as well, right? So it's permissionless and you can do it at any time. So what a lot of communities have are what we call public delegates, or in dYdX's case, it's called endorsed delegates, right? So these are essentially programs where community members or community leaders can actually put up profiles on a website or on a dashboard saying, hey, you know, I have all these different expertise. I've been in this protocol for X number of months or X number of years. These are all the other protocols that I've participated in. These are all my experiences. So you should delegate your tokens to me, right? So it's essentially a platform where people or community members can kind of showcase their talents and get others to delegate to them. So this is something that is very well done by the likes of Optimism. And there are some toolings like a Boardroom which enable platforms like dYdX and Uniswap to actually post all these delegate profiles. So for dYdX in particular, I think we have an endorsed delegate program. And essentially, this program allows, again, individuals to put up their profiles or organizations to put up their profiles and explain why they would be the best address or organization for token holders to kind of delegate their voting powers and proposing powers to. As of today, dYdX endorsed delegates actually account for roughly 53% of all votes, which is very, very powerful. It means that, you know, people who are in the best decision-making positions, like delegates, are actually having good enough say when it comes to voting on proposals and pushing proposals forward, which is quite encouraging to hear. Right, so that is on delegates. There are also models where, you know, we have validators of the chain actually vote, right? And we see this more often than not in dApp chains. In a lot of this actually happens in the Cosmos ecosystem where dYdX is actually moving towards. So these are essentially validators that secure the chain, right? So they actually propose blocks, they actually validate transactions, and they actually vote in proposals, right? So in Cosmos's use case, I think a lot of chains that use the Cosmos SDK to build, they use the governance SDK. It's part of the Cosmos entire suite of SDK. So the governance SDK essentially allows only stake token holders and validators of the chain to essentially vote on proposals, right? So there are quite a few questions that can be raised from this, because a lot of these validators are actually professional validators. They validate many different chains. So how confident is the community in that, you know, these are actually the people that knows the ecosystem, knows the protocol inside and out, and so much so that they can actually make the best possible decision for the protocol moving forward? Just because, like, you know, more often than not, they're spread pretty thinly. Like, they validate many chains, so they might not have the best context to vote in the best interest of the protocol. But, you know, this is what the governance SDK for Cosmos actually allows for today, right? So as token holders, you have to stake your tokens to all these validators to secure the chain, and you can actually vote on proposals as well. But if you don't vote, then your vote is actually inherited by the validators, and they actually can vote on your behalf for all proposals that are on chain. Right, so I think something that I'm personally a little bit more bullish on are council models. So essentially, these are actors that are voted in by community members, right? So two big protocols that are doing this pretty well would be Synthetics as well as Element Finance. So essentially what this means is that, okay, let me just use Synthetics as an example, because I actually am pretty close to them. I work quite closely with their governance lead as well. So they have what we call councils, right? So councils are essentially specific groups that can make decisions on behalf of the community without having to go through an entire governance process, right? So they have the Spartan Council, the Grants Council, the Ambassador Council, and the Treasury Council. And every voting cycle, the token holders of the Synthetics token would actually have to vote certain members into these councils, right? So I believe the voting period is actually 1 week. And then once people are actually voted into these councils, they stay in power. They stay in these councils for, I think, 3 months. And then during this 3 months period, they would actually have to make decisions for their specified jurisdiction. So for example, the grants council will actually decide what grants to give out, to disperse to builders, and then the ambassador council will actually disperse funding or make decisions for synthetics to broaden their reach, broaden their ambassador reach. And then for the Treasury Council, it's the same. Like, how do you actually manage the synthetics treasury? So people in the Treasury Council actually make those decisions on the entire synthetics DAO's behalf, right? So imagine it's like politics, right? Like politicians want to be voted into power, so they will actually explain like what they will do well. And then once they're in power, then they can actually make the best possible decisions. The thing is with DAOs, a lot of the times, like all these council members will actually have to show proof that they are actually providing value, and community members will actually demand that level of transparency and accountability. If not, they would actually be voted out. So in a way that forces a checks and balances system on all these people who are put into power. And if you're not doing your job well, it can show on chain, it can show in all the work that you do, and you will be voted out, right? So this is a model that I'm personally a little bit more bullish on. And it's actually the same for element finance as well. And another form of governance that I've seen that is adopted by ENS. So ENS is essentially the protocol that allows you to get like your Ethereum name service, right? So in my case, you can essentially mint your .eth name. So in my case, I actually own Clifton.eth. I would highly encourage all of you guys to actually get your own ENS domain, right? Because that essentially makes a lot of transactions a lot easier. And you can actually hold that as an identity. But on the governance side, like they are working with this provider called Metropolis to utilize their pod structure. So it's very similar to a council model in the sense that people who are within each pod actually have decision-making powers for that particular area, right? So for example, like public goods, people who are actually working in the pod, in the public goods pod, can actually disperse funds for public goods initiatives. And then similarly for community, like they can disperse funds and they can make decisions for community-based initiatives. And then same for meta governance. So each pod can essentially specialize in their specific area, and they can make decisions on the pod's or for the entire DAO's behalf. And then lastly, we have what we call identity-based voting. So this is a very novel way of voting. So I've used Optimism as a prime example here. And Optimism is actually a protocol that the dYdX Foundation actually looks to for a lot of guidance when it comes to governance. So they have a two-house system when it comes to governance, right? They have a token house as well as a citizen house. So a token house is essentially people who hold OP tokens. It's a one token, one vote model. But on the flip side, the citizen house are actually individuals that are voted in by the Optimism Foundation, by community members to make decisions on retroactive public goods funding, right? So citizens will actually hold a soulbound token, a soulbound NFT. So that is actually an NFT that will stay with that particular address in perpetuity. You can't sell it. You can't buy it on the secondary markets. It's something that is conferred upon you. So this is part of your identity moving forward. And only if you hold that token or if you hold that NFT, then can you make decisions for certain DAOs, right? So in Optimism's case, people who actually are conferred the citizen SBT, the soulbound token, can actually participate in governance when it comes to retroactive public goods funding, which is something that Optimism is very, very well known for. And this is where like token holders don't actually have a say. It's only these select individuals that can decide on what projects should be retroactively funded, specifically for public goods. Right, so I think all in all, all these models tend to solve for these three areas along efficiency, equitable decision-making, and transparency. Even though like Optimism is a protocol that we and a community that we look to for a lot of good practices, a lot of guidance, I don't think they have essentially solved for DAO governance yet. So in order to fully solve for it, I believe that, these 3 areas need to be addressed, right? Governance efficiency, decisions, some need to be made fast, some need to be made slow. But at the same time, we need to make sure that it's equitable. We need to make sure that the community leaders actually have a good enough say. We need to make sure that we don't have whales that come in that can just sway a vote. And then at the same time, we need to make sure that everything is transparently done, because what's the point, right? If everything is done off-chain, then there isn't a need for a blockchain-based DAO in the first place, right? So solving for these 3 areas is, in my opinion, the key to achieve an optimal governance system. So I think I do have a couple of slides left, but let me just exit the presentation and see if there are any other questions again. So, okay, Kasi had a question. So DAO's purpose is for decentralized decision-making. So in case of DAO protocols, is there any restriction on stakeholding limit for any single entity to restrict centralized decision-making? So I think it really depends on how the governance process and how governance is actually designed for each protocol. I don't think there are a lot of protocols that actually restrict how much tokens a specific address can hold, right? But I've read of this concept called quadratic, square root voting. Sorry, I was confused with quadratic funding. It's called square root voting, and it's actually proposed by Jump Capital. Essentially, tries to restrict the number of tokens, voting power, and proposing power, in a sense that, if I actually hold, let me think of a good example. If I hold 64 tokens and you hold 25 tokens, our number of tokens will actually be square rooted, right? So I hold 64, so the square root of that is actually 8, and you hold 25, square root of that is actually 5. So my vote is actually just 8 votes, and your vote is actually 5 votes, which is more equitable in a sense. So I think novel mechanisms like that would be interesting, especially when it comes to public goods funding, especially when it comes to important details about a protocol. This potential structure can solve for whales kind of coming in and just swaying votes and restricting centralized decision making. So yeah, would encourage you to kind of read up on square root voting. It's something that I'm keeping an eye out for as well. So Karthik had another question. Is there a fusion between sub-DAO and council groups? Like each sub-DAO has its own similar council groups. So yeah, I think it's a novel way to experiment. I haven't seen any protocol or community that does both yet. But if you think about it, both structures are actually more or less similar, right? So for example, in MakerDAO, we have what we call core units, right? So all these core units are essentially sub-DAOs of their own, and each core unit might actually decide to have their own governance process, right? So maybe each core unit consists of 100 people, and then for those 100 people, maybe they want to elect just 5 people to make decisions on behalf of that sub-DAO, right? So I wouldn't say that it's impossible, but to me, is actually a similar concept. And I haven't really seen any other protocol implement a hybrid of both sub-DAOs and council, because I think both of them actually achieve the same purpose, and that is to make decisions on behalf of the community for a specific niche or a specific set of parameters, like treasury management, for example, or risk management. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Cool. Yeah. So don't see any other questions. So let me jump back in. Right. So bear with me. I think the last few slides are a little more hands-on per se, right? Because what I would encourage a lot of people is to actually get started in different communities and participate in governance, right? So I've listed down quite a few steps for you to kind of follow. Of course, feel free to find your own ways, but this is something that I would recommend. So first, I'd say, find a protocol, a community, or a DAO that you align with, right? So think about your own interests and try to find if there are any DAOs that are actually in that interest area. So if you're interested in general purpose blockchains, there are, there is Optimism, there's Arbitrum, and there are other layer 1 ecosystems like Solana, for example, that you can participate in. For DeFi, we have obviously dYdX, we have the likes of Uniswap, we have Synthetics. For public goods funding, Optimism again is a huge protocol when it comes to like retroactive public goods funding. There's ENS, and then there's Gitcoin. And then for NFTs, we have Nouns, and then we have like Azuki, or potentially Bored Ape Yacht Club, or CryptoPunks that you guys can kind of explore, right? So ultimately, you need to be interested in that ecosystem. You need to be interested in the product that the DAO is kind of building out. If you're not interested, I think it's very difficult for you to consistently stay engaged, right? So once you find a specific ecosystem or a specific area that you want to be a little bit more engaged with, don't be afraid to join their forums and Discord, right? And understand what the ecosystem is about. Reach out to community members, make friends, make discussions, ask them questions about, what the dynamics are in the ecosystem, and get your name out there, right? So join their forums, join their Discord, and start making conversation, right? You can also look through their grants program to see how you can immediately contribute and potentially get funding, right? So a lot of these grants are actually a mix of technical RFPs as well as non-technical RFPs. So you don't necessarily have to be like technical. You don't necessarily need to know how to code. Like quite a few grants that I've seen today are actually requesting for, creatives or design work, right? So if you have experience on that front, potentially you can work on a grant and get some funding, and that's how you can contribute to that ecosystem as well, right? But if you don't want to go down the grants route, you can also, again, explore the ecosystem, explore how people, what kind of topics people are talking about, explore certain use cases, and identify how you can contribute to the ecosystem and the community, right? Work on it, right? You can chime in on the proposals, you can chime in on the forums, you can chime in on Discord, or you can get to work. You can work on tooling and then potentially roll it out yourself, and then get, potentially get retroactively funded for it. So there are many, many different ways to get into communities. I think it's just a matter of identifying and aligning and finding protocols that you align with, and then just going in deep, making friends, understanding the dynamics of an ecosystem, how it works, and then just getting started, right? So once done, and if there are any proposals, participate in them, right? You can either get the tokens, again, not financial advice, but if you want, go ahead and get the native tokens. You can also potentially create delegate profiles and get people to delegate to you if you are confident to wield that responsibility. And then, don't be afraid to contribute to the governance of the protocol, because if you are a stakeholder, you should have a say in how the protocol progresses. So yeah, those were all my pointers, and feel free to scan this QR code to learn a little bit more about the dYdX Foundation. I believe this links out to the dYdX India Twitter page, but yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, or whatsoever through the dYdX Foundation. And yeah, I hope this session was helpful. Cool. Yeah, Sanjay, you had a question. Feel free to go for it. Sanjay, do you want to ask a question, or you're good?
Sanjay, if you have the question, you can of course reach out to us on our Telegram group.
Yep.
Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah.
No, I just asked, curious to know why the name dYdX.
Oh, that's a interesting question. I actually think that it's because we want to differentiate ourselves as the best protocol out there. And dYdX is the calculus term for differentiate. So yeah, I'm just speculating here.
Differential calculus, essentially. You want to say differentiate. So differential calculus formula you're using.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting. No, it has been, Clifton and Karan, it has been extremely useful session. We are very, very thankful to you. And I'm sure some of these things will go a long way. And we should certainly stay connected.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the kind words. I hope this has been helpful, and really, really nice meeting everyone. Hopefully someday I can come by and you guys can bring me around for good food and drinks.
No, sure. I'm very curious to even explore some opportunity of creating something around financial services, because there are huge application of the solutions that you're talking about around financial services, especially whether it is lending or payments or across you can say contract life cycle or everything, or supply chain management for that matter. I could foresee massive application. So a story has just begun, I guess.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the kind words. I've actually shared a link to the presentation in the Google chat. I've shared like view access. So yeah, hopefully you guys can have good takeaways from this session. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Karan or reach out to me directly. I'm available on Telegram as well. Karan, potentially you can share my contact info or my Twitter profile in the dYdX in the group. And then looking forward to potentially sharing more and learning from you guys. Karan, is there anything else that I should be covering?
No, I think this is great. Thanks for taking the time, Clifton. Of course, would love to host you in India sometime. And thank you everyone for joining. We would be doing another session next week. Thanks to the DHub team for organizing all of this. So yeah, next week we have a session on community growth, and we are also doing an in-person event for all of us to meet together after this 4-week series. Yeah, thank you everyone. Thanks again, Clifton. And it has been a pleasure listening to you. Thanks.
Awesome. All right, everyone have a good night. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll call this guy and get this sorted.
I'm sorry?
No, I think that there was a problem there. That was not for us, Clifton.
Okay, sorry. Thanks everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.